So we've done the first two techniques. It's now time, like I mentioned earlier, to get a little bit crazy, a little bit sci-fi, and we're going to look at 3D projection techniques, which is probably the higher end of cosmetic fixing. I'm going to clear this out, and first of all, I want to show you what we're starting with. Let me open this up. We're going to use the same shot here, but we're going to do a little bit more extensive de-aging of this guy's skin. For these kinds of techniques where you're trying to model the head of the actor, you really need a front-on shot and a side profile shot. So we have this for the front-on and this for the side profile. Now the side profile looks pretty good. He's pretty much staring exactly to screen left. So we have a nice profile. He may be a little tilted towards camera, but this will be good to model the profile of his head. The problem with the front shot is it's more of a three-quarter-y sort of a shot. It's not straight on. So what do you do with that? Well, the secret is you can do an initial pass to fix the perspective of that. So what I did is I had a generic model of a head, and I used PFTrack, which we're about to look at in a moment, to align it to this photo, and you'll see in a moment that's the result. That texture is reprojected onto this basic model, and then I can rephotograph the model facing forwards. So it's not perfect. Obviously the left side isn't particularly useful, but the right hand side I have a much closer match to a front-on perspective of his face, which is going to give me a better reference when I'm modeling it. So with that, we're going to jump over to an application on the Windows side. If it comes up, there we go, called Facial Studio by the wonderful people at Di-O-Matic, who are sponsoring the webinar and giving away a copy of this very software. Well, I'm actually using the full version, but what I'm showing you is completely doable in the Essentials version that is part of the giveaway. So what we do here, I'll just quickly show you how this works, is we start with a model of a generic head, and I want to go in here and first of all change it to be male. There are a bunch of other parameters we can do to get started in terms of the boniness, fatness of the model, which I've actually had to use quite often, muscularity, all these kinds of things, the age. So you can dial all these things in, but the most important part of this application is that we can load up our front side image and we can load up our profile. And I need to flip the profile, which I do here. And this is how this thing works, is you simply drag these sliders to position this spline curve basically where the actor's features are. So we'll do this, we'll line it up, and you get close enough. Running out of screen real estate here, but there we go. And pull this back in. And we do that for both the front and the back. And then we go about grabbing the individual points and starting to line them up properly with the features. So it's a little bit of work, but not much considering how much time it would take to actually do a head from scratch, obviously. So we just line all these things up and we keep working away, and I will cheat and do the old cooking show. Here's one I prepared earlier. And this is the result. This is what we get. A model of the head that matches the basic dimensions of our actor. And it's an amazing application because it saves you a lot of work. I've used this on feature film work a couple of times, and it really holds up well. So that gives us a model. Now, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be as good as a head scan. It would be great if I had a head scan, but it's pretty rare that I get any of that kind of level of detail. Usually the sort of things you're doing when you're doing cosmetic fixes are afterthoughts, and no one ever thought, hey, we should scan the actor's head going into this. So you do what you can. So this is kind of a close enough approximation of this guy's head. Then we can export that as an object, and I'll quit out of here for now. And we'll now go into Nuke, and I'll show you, well, actually, sorry, the next stop is PFTrack. So I'll bring that up. Okay, so we've got this open. This is our clip. This is node-based as well, but it's kind of a token node-based architecture. It's pretty simple. So we add a geometry track here, and what I will do is go ahead. Well, first of all, I'm going to set this camera up. This is another important thing. I have to guess what the camera focal length is. I'm going to guess 75 millimeters. I have no idea how close it is. I've got good friends that work in practical effects, and they can pretty much eyeball a shot and within 5 degrees tell me the focal length of the camera. But I just kind of fudge it till it works. So I'm going for 75 millimeters on this shot. Seems to work. And what I'm going to do is have a look. I'll just move to frame 148 because I have a nice 3/4 profile that represents the most detail that I'm going to get in terms of the movement of the shot, because sometimes he's looking screen left, sometimes he's looking front on. At 148 we have a decent 3/4 profile, and we're now going to load our model, which is right here, and in it comes, and I'll click the view button down here to view it. Now it doesn't look particularly impressive right now, but it will work well. The first thing we want to do is weight shade the model. So there's our model, and what I can do is I can go into a paint mode, and I can actually tell the tracker to ignore certain parts of the geometry. So his neck is not going to be worth tracking because we don't see enough of it. I know for a fact on this particular shot that we never see the back of his head, so I'm going to paint that out so that PFTrack's not trying to do anything with that. And in fact, the left side, his right side of his head, screen left, we never see beyond his cheekbone. So I will paint that out so it's not figured in. And top of his head, obviously, there's a hat on it, so we don't actually see it either. So we're just saying the green area is the only bits that we want PFTrack to even consider when it's tracking. Now I'll do a little bit of cleanup. I'll switch the weight to positive and maybe, just to be safe, bring back a little of this stuff here, just in case we do see some of those pixels there. But that's pretty good. The one other thing is we know from earlier that he does in fact blink. So the eye socket detail isn't completely reliable. It's not locked on. What we're trying to tell PFTrack is the green stuff is our areas where we know that things are a rigid body. And by rigid body, I mean they don't move independent of each other. They all move together. So I'm going to change the weight a little bit around the eyes just to say, hey, you can use this stuff in calculating the track, but don't rely on it too heavily because it's subject to move when he blinks, for example. So I'm going to do that. And now we're ready to track. And PFTrack has this pretty cool system. Click the view button again to get him back. And it's called pin mode. So I'll go to pin mode, and I can now put little pins in different parts of the geometry. I'll also, by the way, switch to what's called transparent mode. Change the mesh color to a blue. It's going to be a little easier to see. There we go. And now I can grab different parts of the geometry and pin them to tell PFTrack which parts of my geometry correspond to which parts of the image it's trying to track. So I'll grab strategic points in the geometry, line them up. Let's grab something on the chin and say the chin actually comes down to here. And you'll see very quickly that I've got a pretty decent lineup of my model relative to the image. Now it's not going to be perfect, and depending on how sophisticated the shot you're working on is, you may need to be more or less perfect in how you put it together. The most important thing in this case is if we're doing cosmetic fixes around this area, we want that area to match pretty well. So I'm concerned about the eye positioning and then the nose positioning. And I'll keep kind of pushing and pulling these around until I'm comfortable I've got a compromise. Now these really aren't working well if it doesn't matter what you do, but they end up being way off. Then the chances are either your model is completely wrong in shape or the focal length is off. I'm going to have to settle for this in a second. Oops. Let's leave it about there. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and track, and what you'll see is, well, actually, I'm a little off. Let me go back, and I'll reset the pins on this one. I think I picked a bad pin position. There we go. Grab something in the nose, pull it forward. That's actually pretty good right there. Grab that chin, pull it down. Let's just try tracking that. There you go. So you'll see it does a pretty miraculous job of lining the geometry up with the movement of the head. And this is pretty much all there is. Now, I would love to say every shot I've worked on tracks this nicely. And I have to say that almost none of the shots I've ever worked on have tracked this nicely, because typically the actors are doing annoying things like delivering lines during the shot. It's very inconvenient. Actors rarely do what they're supposed to do for visual effects shots. They try to have personality and all kinds of annoying things. So, you know, what we usually end up having to do is stop setting keyframes to reset the position of the mesh as it goes through. There's not a whole lot of motion blur on this shot, which helps. And actually, quite honestly, because of the character in this guy's face, that he has those deep, well-lived, weathered lines, that actually gives a lot of texture that helps the tracker run its track. And that's actually pretty cool. So this will track really nicely. Just as an aside, even this shot will not be 100% accurate. It looks, as it's tracking through right now, like it's just nailing it at every single frame. But there is such subtle little changes in this that you'll end up finding when you go back to apply the fixes that there is some slippage. So for what we're about to do by applying skin texture, never going to notice. But if you were trying to add a scar or add some kind of additional facial item to the side of the face, you're going to notice it slip during the turns. The solution to that is actually do a hybrid approach where we do this track first and then we actually do a 2D mocha track afterwards just to lock it into place. So I'm not going to finish this because I've done it before, and I'll pull another one out of the oven. But we would just run that through, and then when it's all done, we can go and choose an export node, and it exports to most of the flavors of your choice. Maya, Maya ASCII for Adobe After Effects. You've got OBJs, animated sequences. You've got Apple Motion cameras and projects. You've got FBXs, which covers a lot of stuff, obviously. Collada, pretty much whatever you want. Even if you're still working by some miracle in Shake 4.1, you can use that. You can export the Lightwave, all kinds of wonderful goodies in there, and that's all very exciting. So once you've got your exported scene, it's going to come in, and I will open that up. And so here we have our source footage, back just what we're used to. But now I have a model of the shot. And let me show you how this works. I can actually project, using the camera that PFTrack solved, I can project the footage back onto my 3D object. And lo and behold, in 3D, we can actually see the footage superimposed over this head model. So as I move to different frames, you'll see the texture changes because it's now projecting whatever the texture was at that frame. But notice how, even though the head turns during the shot, it doesn't turn here on the model. Why? Because the way PFTrack solved the scene is so that the head stands still and the camera moves. So instead of the head turning, the camera is actually turning. You'll see it right there. So it's turning to simulate the change between the position of the camera and position of the head through those shots. All right, so what can we do with this? Well, that is a great question. Well, the good news is we can start by simply projecting a UV texture. Now, people often get disturbed by this, but that's what a UV texture looks like. Basically, we've skinned the poor guy, and we're now seeing what he looks like if his skin was basically laid flat on a table. And what that allows us to do is fix up certain areas. Now, I've done a quick job here. This would not pass muster in a final production, but I just grabbed royalty-free skin texture and applied it. Now, it's the wrong kind of skin texture, really, for this face. It's a little too even, and it doesn't really have the follicles that a face has. But hey, it's what we got. It's what we're going to use. And so what I did is I applied it just over the top of this image, so it's going to cover up the areas I want to fix. You can see that there. And what we're going to do is we're going to project that onto our footage. And first of all, I'll show you what that looks like with this one, right? So if I now render the scene out, whoops, I've got this project 3D. I don't need the project 3D. That's better. This is just the 2D skin reapplied over the top of our 3D model. And so now he's basically mimicking everything that the original shot did. But it's a still of his skin texture. There it is, kind of creepy. So what we're going to do instead is replace that out with our fake skin, like so. Doesn't look very impressive at this point, but what we're also going to do is mask off the area where we want to apply it. I'm going to come in here, and I will go ahead and say, okay, we want to replace skin texture around here, all around here. We'll leave his eyebrows in the picture. Maybe I'll try and come down here. It might look a little unrealistic, but we'll just You know what, I will. That's not going to sell without a bit more work. All right, so we'll do something like that and say that's the area we want to graft the skin. Okay, so I'll add that as a matte. And so we got a skin texture. We'll just pre-multiply this in here. Whoops. I'm going to turn off clipping. Bang. There we have it. And that's our skin mask. Now I'm going to blur it because no composite is complete without blurring things to pieces. And now I'm going to comp that over the top of my source footage. And you're going to be unimpressed. Okay, that does not look particularly convincing just yet. There's two more things we have to do. One is we're going to adjust the intensity of it, but the other thing is we're going to do a lighting match. And this is a top secret little gag that I'm giving away for free today. But basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to match the lighting sources by blurring. So here's what I do is I take my patch here and quickly dilate it a little bit, and then I'll comp the original over. So this is my patch. I'm going to blur it. What blurring does is it removes all of the local subtleties and changes. And I'll do that both to my patch, but I'll also do it to the source footage. I did tell you we're going to get a little sci-fi here, so here we go. So as I blur this, I'm removing all of the localized detail, but I'm keeping the general shading information. You'll see that the shadow is still basically where it is up here. The shading of the skin is the same all the way around. So here's the magic trick. I'm now going to divide this basic lighting of the original plate source footage by the blurred version of my comp. And that gives me this. Now what am I going to do with that? I'm going to multiply that back against my source footage, and that will introduce the lighting of my source clip. Sorry, I multiplied against my patch, and now that adds the shading detail of the source footage to my patch. So now I need to bring back the alpha channel so I have something to comp with. Now through the magic of modern technology, we have a lighting match, and now I can just dial this back in until it looks natural. So let's say we go to about here. This is my result, and this is the original. Okay, got a little bit of cleanup to do over here with a bit of roto just to get rid of the overlap there. You can see what a dramatic change is in terms of still keeping some of the tonal detail of the original shot, but smoothing out the skin tone by basically blending back in an unwrinkled version of the skin. And I can dial that in as much or as little as the director would like. Now my preference would be to back off even more. It's going to look much more natural down around here. But I suspect probably a director, if the point was to de-age, would be wanting to go a lot heavier than that. But that's pretty much the technique. So the same thing here. Now you see, obviously, because we've mapped the geometry, no matter where that head moves, that skin patch is going to move with it, and we have that natural de-wrinkling throughout the shot, even when he turns to the side profile and when he turns front to camera. And we could do the same thing with a scar, a lesion, a robotic, a prosthetic implant, whatever we want, and it's going to move with the model. And again, I mentioned this before, but the one other thing you would need to do on those shots to make it super tight is you would also need to then mocha track just to really lock it solidly in place after you've done this part.